People often imagine that extreme financial success must come from extreme activity. They imagine chaos, urgency, and constant motion. They picture investors staring at glowing monitors all night, shouting orders into phones and making hundreds of rapid decisions every day. This image has been repeated so many times in movies, news stories, and business culture that most people accept it without questioning it. But when you examine how many of the most successful capital allocators actually live, the reality looks strangely different. Their lives are quiet. Their offices are quiet. Their schedules are often almost empty. Instead of constant motion, there are long stretches of silence. Instead of urgent meetings, there are hours of reading. Instead of reacting to every market fluctuation, there are long periods of observation and patience. To the average person, this looks confusing. Sometimes it even looks irresponsible. People see a quiet schedule and immediately assume that nothing important is happening. This assumption reveals how deeply modern culture has confused activity with progress. From the moment people enter school, they are trained to believe that effort must always be visible. Students who appear busy are praised. Employees who appear constantly occupied are promoted. Managers measure productivity by how many meetings fill the calendar and how quickly emails receive replies. Over time, an invisible rule becomes embedded into the collective mind. If you are busy, you must be important. If you are exhausted, you must be successful. If you are constantly moving, you must be making progress. But in the world of wealth creation, this belief is dangerously wrong. In many cases, busyness is not a signal of success. It is a signal that you are trapped inside a system designed to consume your time. True wealth is rarely built through constant motion. It is built through a small number of extremely important decisions made with extreme clarity. And clarity requires something that modern life systematically destroys. It requires cognitive bandwidth. Your cognitive bandwidth is the total mental energy your brain can use in a single day. It is the fuel behind every complex thought you have. It powers your ability to analyze information, recognize patterns, control emotions, and make strategic decisions. But unlike money, cognitive bandwidth does not accumulate. It resets every morning. When you wake up, your mind starts the day with a full battery. You have the ability to think deeply, plan carefully, and process complex information. But that battery drains quickly. Every notification steals a little energy. Every decision burns a little more. Every interruption forces the brain to recalibrate its focus. By the time most people reach the middle of their day, a large portion of their cognitive bandwidth has already been spent on things that have absolutely no long-term impact on their lives. The modern professional wakes up to the sound of an alarm. Within seconds, they are staring at a phone screen. Messages, alerts, and news updates flood their attention before their brain has even fully awakened. The mind immediately enters a reactive state. Instead of beginning the day with clarity, it begins with noise. Then comes the morning commute, traffic, crowds, stress, unpredictable delays. Each of these experiences consumes more mental energy. By the time the average worker arrives at their job, their cognitive battery is already partially depleted, and the real drain has not even begun yet. Work environments are filled with constant interruptions, meetings that stretch far beyond their useful purpose, emails that demand immediate replies, messages that appear every few minutes, asking for small clarifications. Each interruption forces the brain to switch context. Context switching is extremely expensive for the mind. Every time your attention jumps from one task to another, the brain must rebuild its understanding of the new situation. This process burns mental energy rapidly. By early afternoon, many people are operating on a fraction of the cognitive bandwidth they started the day with. They drink coffee or energy drinks to artificially maintain focus. But stimulants do not restore bandwidth. They simply push an already tired system to keep running. As the day continues, decision fatigue begins to appear. The brain becomes slower at evaluating complex problems. Small decisions start feeling overwhelming. At this stage, the mind stops thinking strategically and begins thinking defensively. The goal becomes survival rather than progress. When the workday finally ends, the cognitive battery is nearly empty. The brain is no longer capable of deep thought. Instead of planning long-term investments, designing scalable systems, or studying opportunities, the exhausted mind looks for immediate relief. Relief often arrives through distraction, streaming services, social media, random internet browsing, impulsive online purchases. These activities feel relaxing because they require almost no mental effort. but they also ensure that the next day will begin exactly the same way as the last. The system does not need to physically trap people. It only needs to keep their cognitive bandwidth permanently depleted, because a mind that never has time to think deeply will never question the structure of its life. A depleted mind becomes extremely easy to control, not because it is weak, because it no longer has the energy required for reflection. Reflection is dangerous to systems built on routine. The moment a person steps back and calmly examines the architecture of their life, the cracks become visible. They begin to notice that their income depends on continued compliance. They begin to notice that their schedule belongs more to other people than to themselves. They begin to notice that years of effort have created stability, but not freedom. That is why the modern world competes so aggressively for attention. Attention is not just a media metric. It is the gateway to human agency. If your attention is fragmented, your thinking becomes fragmented. If your thinking becomes fragmented, your decisions become reactive. If your decisions become reactive, your life slowly becomes shaped by urgency instead of design. Most people think the greatest financial trap is low income. It isn't. Low income creates pressure, but pressure can still produce awareness. The more dangerous trap is total cognitive exhaustion combined with moderate comfort. That condition keeps people functioning just well enough to survive, and just poorly enough to never transform. They are too tired to think strategically, too comfortable to feel desperate, too busy to step back. This is the perfect environment for dependency. The person wakes up, works, returns home exhausted, distracts themselves, sleeps, and repeats. The cycle feels normal because everyone around them is doing the same thing. Entire social circles normalize mental depletion. People joke about burnout. They laugh about stress. They brag about never unplugging. A culture that celebrates depletion makes recovery look lazy. A culture that worships busyness makes stillness look suspicious. But stillness is where high-level thinking actually begins. You cannot see the structure of your life clearly while sprinting through it. You cannot recognize leverage while trapped in constant reaction. You cannot build wealth if every day consumes all the energy required to think beyond the next bill, the next deadline, or the next obligation. This is why many hard-working, intelligent people remain financially average for decades. Their issue is not lack of discipline, it is misallocated bandwidth. They are spending their best mental energy solving other people's problems. By the time they finally have a free hour, the battery is gone. An empty battery creates predictable behavior. The exhausted mind seeks comfort over challenge. It chooses convenience over creation. It buys relief instead of building leverage. Cooking dinner feels difficult, so food gets delivered. Reading a difficult book feels impossible, so television becomes the default. Studying markets or business models requires clarity, so scrolling becomes the easier option. These decisions seem small, but they compound, just like investments do. Small bandwidth leaks become long-term structural weakness. A person who loses 3 hours every evening to low-value distraction is not merely wasting time. They are losing the only hours in the day that could have been redirected toward escape velocity. Most people think they need more motivation. What they actually need is more preserved cognitive energy. Motivation cannot overpower chronic depletion forever. Discipline weakens when the nervous system is constantly overloaded. Willpower is finite. Bandwidth is fundamental. This is why the people who appear patient.com and strangely detached from modern urgency often outperform everyone else over time. They are not lazy. They are protected. They understand that the mind is not an infinite machine. They understand that every input has a cost. They understand that clarity is a competitive advantage. And once you begin to see attention as capital, your entire interpretation of modern life changes. A pointless meeting is no longer an inconvenience. It is a withdrawal from your decision-making reserve. A morning spent reacting to messages is no longer just part of work. It is a strategic loss of future leverage. A chaotic day filled with interruptions is not merely frustrating, it is expensive. This is the invisible tax most people pay every day. Not a tax on money, a tax on cognition. And it is often far more destructive than a financial tax because it removes the very resource required to build an alternative. A worker can lose 20% of their income and still eventually recover. But a worker who loses 100% of their cognitive bandwidth every day may never gather the clarity needed to change course at all. That is why the truly dangerous environments are not always the poorest ones. They are the ones that leave people mentally bankrupt, while giving them just enough income to remain obedient. Once you understand this, you begin to notice how many structures depend on keeping people mentally scattered. The endless notifications, the urgent workplace culture, the always-on expectation, the social pressure to remain available at all times. None of this is accidental. A person with a full battery is difficult to manipulate. They can say no. They can delay reaction. They can think independently. They can tolerate silence long enough to notice uncomfortable truths. But a person running on fumes becomes highly predictable. They seek relief, reassurance, and simplicity. They avoid complexity. They cling to routine. They follow the path already laid out for them. This is why protecting bandwidth is not a luxury for the wealthy. It is the first condition required for becoming wealthy in the first place. Once you begin to see cognitive bandwidth as capital, something strange starts happening. Many behaviors that once looked normal suddenly look incredibly expensive. Checking your phone every few minutes is no longer harmless. It is a constant withdrawal from your mental reserves. Endless news consumption stops looking like awareness. It begins to look like emotional manipulation. You start noticing how many people are reacting all day long, reacting to emails, reacting to market headlines, reacting to office politics, reacting to social media debates. Reaction is exhausting because it forces your mind to process other people's priorities. And when your priorities are constantly interrupted, your own long-term strategy never has space to develop. Most workers live inside a permanent reaction loop. Something demands attention. They respond. Another demand appears. They respond again. The cycle continues hour after hour. From the outside it looks productive, but from a strategic perspective, almost none of that activity compounds. The majority of daily work is maintenance. It keeps the system running, but it rarely builds anything that grows independently of your time. This is the fundamental difference between labor and leverage. Labor requires constant input. Stop working and the output stops immediately. Leverage requires preparation, but once it is built, it begins producing results on its own. Assets behave this way. Systems behave this way. Ideas that scale behave this way. But building leverage requires something most people never have during the week: uninterrupted thought. Leverage is rarely discovered in the middle of chaos. It appears during calm observation, when the mind has the freedom to analyze patterns instead of reacting to noise. Think about how many meaningful strategic decisions you can make while answering messages every 3 minutes. Almost none. Deep thinking requires continuity. The brain must hold complex variables in working memory long enough to examine relationships between them. Interrupt that process repeatedly, and the thinking collapses. That is why many of the world's most successful investors, entrepreneurs, and thinkers appear strangely slow in their daily rhythm. They protect long stretches of quiet time. They read slowly, they think slowly, they make decisions slowly. But when the moment for action arrives, they move quickly and with enormous conviction. This pattern looks lazy from the outside because modern culture has trained people to equate speed with competence. But strategic thinking has its own pace. It is not fast. It is deliberate. It is patient. And patience becomes extremely powerful when the rest of the world is reacting impulsively. This difference becomes most visible during periods of uncertainty. Markets crash, industries shift, entire economic narratives collapse almost overnight. When those moments arrive, the majority of participants are already mentally exhausted. They have spent months or years reacting to every fluctuation. Their cognitive battery is empty. So when the real crisis appears, they panic. Fear floods their nervous system. They search for certainty. They look for someone else to tell them what to do. Media channels amplify the panic because panic generates attention. Attention generates advertising revenue. The cycle accelerates. Investors sell assets not because they have analyzed the long-term situation, but because the emotional pressure becomes unbearable. Selling provides psychological relief, even if it destroys long-term wealth. But the person who preserved cognitive bandwidth experiences the same moment very differently. They are not exhausted. They are not reacting to every headline. They are not emotionally overloaded. Their mind is clear. Instead of panic, they see asymmetry. When fear pushes prices far below intrinsic value, opportunity appears. The same asset that looked expensive during the excitement of a bull market suddenly becomes attractive when everyone else is desperate to escape it. This is where the famous phrase about markets transferring wealth begins to make sense. Capital does not disappear during crises, it changes hands. The impatient give it up, the patient absorb it, but patience is impossible without bandwidth. You cannot remain calm when your nervous system is already overwhelmed. You cannot evaluate risk rationally when your mind is running on fumes. This is why so many people who understand investing in theory still fail in practice. They read the books, they know the principles, they understand long-term compounding. But when volatility appears, exhaustion takes control. The emotional brain overrides the analytical one. They sell, and the cycle begins again. The people who consistently win in these environments are not necessarily smarter. They are simply less depleted. They preserved their attention long enough to recognize the moment that actually matters. And when that moment appears, they still have the mental energy required to act. The strange thing about cognitive bandwidth is that it rarely feels valuable in the moment. Most people only recognize its importance after they have already lost it. They notice it when their mind becomes foggy, when simple decisions start feeling heavy, when even small tasks require enormous effort. At that stage, the brain is no longer operating strategically. It is operating defensively. Defensive thinking focuses on avoiding discomfort rather than building opportunity. It chooses what feels safe today instead of what compounds tomorrow. This is why many intelligent people spend years moving in circles financially. They are working extremely hard, but their thinking is constrained by constant depletion. Every important idea requires energy. Every long-term plan requires sustained attention. And sustained attention has become one of the rarest resources in the modern world. Look at how the average day is structured. Phones vibrate constantly. Emails arrive every few minutes. Messages demand instant replies. Entire professional cultures are built around responsiveness rather than reflection. If someone replies immediately, they are seen as engaged. If someone takes time to think before responding, they are often seen as slow. But thoughtful decision-making always appears slow compared to impulsive reaction. That difference creates an interesting paradox. The people who look the most productive in the short term are often the least strategic in the long term. Their days are full of motion. Their calendars are full of meetings. Their attention is constantly fragmented. Meanwhile, the people building real leverage often look strangely inactive. They decline unnecessary commitments. They spend long hours reading. They allow their mind to wander across complex problems without interruption. This style of work feels uncomfortable to anyone raised in a culture that glorifies constant motion. Silence can feel unproductive. Empty space in a schedule can feel irresponsible. But those quiet spaces are exactly where strategic insight begins to appear. When the brain is not under pressure, it starts connecting ideas. Patterns that were previously invisible suddenly become obvious. The mind begins asking different questions. Instead of asking how to complete another task, it asks how the entire system could be redesigned. Instead of asking how to work harder, it asks how effort could be multiplied. These questions rarely appear inside chaotic environments. They require calm observation, and calm observation requires bandwidth. This is why the most powerful decision-makers treat their attention as sacred territory. They filter inputs aggressively. They protect long blocks of uninterrupted time. They limit exposure to noise that does not contribute to long-term understanding. To outsiders, this behavior can appear detached or even antisocial. But from a strategic perspective, it is simply resource management. The mind is not an unlimited processor. It is a finite system that must allocate its energy carefully. Spend that energy reacting to minor disturbances, and nothing meaningful gets built. Preserve it for deep thinking, and suddenly possibilities expand. Once a person experiences this shift, they begin seeing the world differently. They start recognizing how many opportunities exist beyond the structures they once believed were permanent. They begin noticing inefficiencies in industries. They begin recognizing patterns in human behavior. They begin imagining systems that could function independently of their time. These insights are the raw material of leverage. But leverage always begins as a quiet idea before it becomes a visible outcome, which means the people who create it must be comfortable appearing inactive for long periods of time. They must tolerate the silence where others seek distraction, because in that silence, the architecture of the future slowly forms, and once the structure becomes clear enough, action becomes obvious. At that point, the person who preserves their bandwidth moves quickly, not with frantic activity, but with focused execution. A single well-placed decision can redirect years of effort, and the people who seem the busiest in the world often miss those moments entirely, not because they lack intelligence, but because their attention was already spent elsewhere. Once you begin protecting your cognitive bandwidth, a quiet transformation starts happening. At first it feels small. You notice that your mind is calmer in the morning. You notice that you can focus on a single idea for longer than before. You notice that problems which once looked overwhelming now appear more manageable. This is not magic. It is simply what happens when the brain is allowed to operate at full capacity again. Clarity begins to return. And with clarity comes a new type of question. Instead of asking how to survive the next month, the mind starts asking how the next 10 years could look different. Long-term thinking slowly replaces short-term reaction. But reclaiming bandwidth is only the first step. The next step is deciding how that energy will be used. Most people make the mistake of immediately filling their recovered time with more activity, more projects, more commitments, more responsibilities. They recreate the same exhaustion that trapped them before. True leverage does not come from doing more things. It comes from doing fewer things with much greater precision. This requires discipline. You must learn to say no to almost everything. Not because opportunities are rare, but because attention is. Every obligation carries a hidden cost. Every meeting consumes energy. Every distraction delays the moment when something truly meaningful could be built. The people who eventually escape the cycle of constant labor develop a simple rule. If something does not contribute to long-term leverage, it receives very little attention. This does not mean ignoring responsibilities. It means being extremely selective about where mental energy is invested. Over time, this focus begins producing results. You start recognizing patterns in markets that others overlook. You start identifying industries where inefficiencies exist. You start seeing how systems can be designed to function without constant supervision. Ideas that once seemed abstract slowly become practical. Small experiments begin appearing. An investment here, a small system there. A skill developed quietly in the background. At first, the financial results may look insignificant: $10, $50, a small return from an asset that required months of learning. But something important has already happened. The structure of your life has started changing. For the first time, income is not coming exclusively from direct labor. Even if the amount is tiny, the mechanism is powerful. Because systems behave differently from jobs. A job resets every day. A system accumulates. And accumulation is where compounding begins. The early stages of compounding rarely attract attention. Growth appears slow. Friends and co-workers may not even notice what you are building, but over time the curve begins to change. The small machine you created begins producing more output. The knowledge you accumulated begins revealing better opportunities. The bandwidth you protected allows you to recognize patterns faster than before. Momentum slowly builds. Years later, the difference becomes obvious. To people who started in similar situations, suddenly live completely different lives. One is still trading time for money, still dependent on schedules, approvals, and constant activity. The other has built structures that operate even when they are resting. Neither path was determined by intelligence alone. The difference began much earlier. It began with attention. One person allowed their bandwidth to be consumed by noise. The other protected it long enough to build leverage. This is the quiet truth about wealth. It is not created by frantic motion. It is created by rare moments of clear thinking followed by focused action. Those moments cannot appear inside chaos. They require silence. They require patience. They require the courage to step away from constant stimulation. The world will continue competing for your attention. Employers will demand responsiveness. Algorithms will demand engagement. News cycles will demand emotional reaction. All of them profit from your distraction. But the individuals who eventually build real independence follow a different path. They treat attention like capital. They invest it carefully. They protect it aggressively. And over time that protection allows something extraordinary to happen. While everyone else is reacting to the present, they are quietly constructing the future. Not through endless activity, but through deliberate, patient, high-leverage thinking. And once that process begins, the system that once controlled your time slowly loses its power. Because the moment your mind becomes truly your own again, everything else eventually follows.